So the Faceless Ones is a bit of a mixed bag of a serial. It's not bad, but has a few problems which really hold it back, both in terms of length and the use of its companions. But unlike It's an Airport, let's make the wait for the event short and get into the plot. So the serial begins with the TARDIS landing on a runway at Gatwick Airport, sticking the quartet in immediate danger as soon as they arrive, first due to the potential threat of being hit by a plane, and soon the threat of the police. This leads to the quartet splitting up, with them not all reuniting until the very end of the serial, although yes, the scene in which they split up is quite funny, given the Doctor tells them to scatter and 3 of them run off together, with only Ben going in a different direction. During this fleeing, the TARDIS is moved, being taken to a hangar to be kept out of the way, and the Doctor kind of forgets about it, with finding it taking a back seat as the plot takes over. So before going on to discuss the plot, I think it's best to address Ben and Polly, because they are heavily sidelined in this serial. So as you may or may not know, this is their final serial, and like with Dodo before them, they are absent from a lot of the serial, although do at least get a final scene. The 2 of them only appear in episodes 1, 2 and at the end of 6, with a side character taking over the companion role for the majority of the serial. With their minimal involvement, I'll discuss them first and get them over and done with. So Polly becomes separated from the Doctor and Jamie and ends up in the storeroom for Chameleon Tours, where she witnesses the murder of a detective who has been investigating the company due to several disappearances which have occurred. Polly does escape and reunite with the Doctor and Jamie, who then take a look at the body, but when going to find someone in authority, Polly is captured by Spencer and is frozen before being put in a storage crate, with her later being found by Ben when he stumbles into the storeroom. The next time we see Polly, it is in fact not Polly, and instead is a chameleon duplicate, who is undercover but immediately encounters the Doctor and Jamie at customs. From there, her duplicate is put to work at the Chameleon Tour's desk, before later being recalled to their ship in episode 2. Ben somehow feels like he does absolutely nothing in the serial, disappearing for a chunk of episode 1 and returning in episode 2 to spend a bit of time with the Doctor and Jamie before being captured by Captain Blade and completely disappearing, without even a duplicate appearing. And that's kind of it for the 2 of them. They disappear a third into the serial and just act as a thing the Doctor has to rescue, but barely get mentioned, as there are other stakes which are more important to the rest of the cast. The biggest person to rescue is probably the standing companion's brother, as he got mentioned more often and his disappearance actually moves the plot along. But with them covered, let's move on to Chameleon Tours itself and the aliens behind it. So as it should be obvious, Chameleon Tours is a front for an alien invasion of sorts, with these aliens being called the Chameleons, a race of faceless aliens who lost their identities due to a gigantic explosion. This also led to their race beginning to die out. Now obviously this does sound a bit silly, and the serial itself doesn't actually explain anything about the explosion, which means we'll have to speculate. But given that the damage is both to their physical features and is causing them to die out as a species, means that it was potentially some sort of atomic explosion. But anyway, this has caused the Chameleons to have to search out a new home planet, with Earth being the selected world. Their plan is to kidnap humans and replace them with themselves, while they store the humans within their satellite in a miniaturized state. This happens by having cheap flights which young people are tricked into going on, and then they are taken to the satellite by the spaceship plane, with the number reaching 50,000 by the time the Doctor stops them. This plan was created by the director, who takes the form of Inspector Crossland towards the end of the serial. So it's an interesting scheme, and having it so the villains can be anyone and fit into the background is very creepy, although the serial does reveal who is a chameleon as soon as they're introduced, which means that there are no characters who show up and then get revealed to be a villain, which definitely was a missed opportunity. Ironically, the Doctor uses a similar technique to trick the chameleons by pretending to be one of them who's changed his disguise, and goes to the satellite with the real Nurse Pinto. So here's where we have to discuss this plan's ultimate flaw and why it all fell apart. This comes in the form of how the chameleons disguise themselves as humans. This is through a device worn on the wrist of both the chameleons and the human subjects. These devices are used to maintain the chameleon's transformation, but they can also destroy the chameleons if fiddled with, meaning that their originals, the humans, have to be protected. This is where the plan all falls apart, as many of the chameleons who work at the airport have their originals hidden in the airport, which allows for the staff to find them and use them as leverage. This causes the chameleons to turn on the director and soon killing him. Ultimately, the chameleons agree to the Doctor's terms to save their own lives and return all the humans before leaving for their home planet. Although due to the scale of the abduction, it's highly improbable that this entire thing occurred prior to the Doctor and Jamie leaving, which means that there's very little guarantee of the chameleons keeping their word. So this is an interesting idea for a serial. So good in fact that the basic idea is basically reused and refined for the Zygons later. But one big problem is that the serial is a bit too long for its own good. It moves at a bit of a slow pace with a decent amount of padding, or at least what feels like padding. Then there's times when the chameleons act a bit stupid, with the most notable example being in episode 4, where the Doctor, Jamie and Samantha are at the mercy of Spencer, but instead of being killed, are put into an elaborate death trap very similar to that of the laser beam from Goldfinger, which they obviously escape. Now there is certainly enough plot to fill the serial, but because of its length, it means that the villains either can't kill or interact with the heroes, which seriously weakens them. Similarly, in episode 2, the Doctor discovers that Meadows, who works at air traffic control, is a chameleon duplicate, but doesn't tell anyone, but then proceeds to act suspiciously around him and even demonstrates the freezing pen on the cup he is holding, actually asking for him personally to be the subject holding it. Now, it does make sense that the Doctor wouldn't reveal information about who is the duplicate in this scenario due to the fact that anyone could be one, but that doesn't show in other circumstances where he's very open with information. So let's talk about the actual characters, and I'll start with the notable chameleons. The most notable is of course Captain Blade, who is the pilot of the aircraft and serves as the main villain until the introduction of the director at the end. He is assisted by Spencer, and then there's Nurse Pinto, who is the one who carries out the transformations on Earth. Nurse Pinto is unique among the chameleons, as she is the only one on Earth to know the location of her original, which allows her a level of safety which the others don't have, although the original is discovered by the Doctor and Co in episode 5. There isn't much to say about Spencer, as he's just a lackey to Captain Blade, being the one who is usually in the hangar dealing with the operations there, notably being the one who puts the Doctor and Co in the elaborate trap in episode 4, and being the one who tried to freeze the Doctor previously but failed. Captain Blade is probably the most interesting, if just because he has the most screen time and acts as quite an intimidating villain for the first few parts. He's played by Donald Pickering, who previously played Eisen in The Keys of Marinus, and he gives a great performance here too. He does give a very inhuman feel to Blade without making him seem a bit too off in his performance. Very much in the uncanny valley, where he seems human but just a bit off to make you raise an eyebrow. He does defect at the end against the director when he learns that he might be destroyed, which does give him a bit of depth, but just for his own survival. On the director, he's very underwhelming. Played by Bernard Kay, who had previously been in both Dalek Invasion of Earth and The Crusade, he gives a great performance as expected of him, but because the director doesn't appear until the very end, it means he doesn't really get a chance to be a threatening villain. He's just a bit underwhelming, and is overthrown and killed only a short while after meeting the Doctor and having their confrontation. But due to this being a double role, Bernard Kay also plays Inspector Crossland, who is a better part as he actually does stuff, being the figure in power and who is more open to the Doctor's ideas, meaning he is able to push the Commandant in the earlier part until he goes along with what the Doctor is saying after disbelieving him at the beginning. And since I've mentioned him, let's talk about the Commandant. So the Commandant is the main authority figure within the serial, opposed to the Doctor at the beginning, before later working with him to stop the chameleons. He is basically all powerful within the airport, which makes him a powerful opposing force at the beginning. He does humour the Doctor about the body, but by the time they reach the storeroom, it's been moved, which reinforces his belief that the Doctor is a nutter. Although due to the presence of Inspector Crossland, the Commandant changes his ways, and once evidence begins to build up, he is far more open to the Doctor, although still acts sceptical at times. We also have the character Jean, who is the secretary of the Commandant, and is played by one Wanda Ventham. Now obviously there's something I could say about her, but even if I do, I know the comments will be full of people saying it anyway, so I won't bother. So anyway, Jean ends up being very helpful to the Doctor, and far more trustful than the Commandant, helping him on several occasions, either by phoning up the airport which Chameleon Tours landed at, which leads to the revelation that there are never any passengers who get off the flights, this being something she does on her own accord without anyone asking, I want to note. Then later feigns being ill to get Nurse Pinto out at the medical centre, which leads to a humorous moment of getting the Commandant in trouble. Then we have Samantha, who is the one who basically takes the place of Ben and Polly. She is searching for her missing brother, who went on the Chameleon Tours flight and never returned, having only sent a single postcard. Her suspicion brings her to the airport, where she meets Jamie and later the Doctor, with her eventually deciding to go on the Chameleon Tours flight herself to find out the truth. But her ticket is taken by Jamie, which is how he ends up on the satellite, and with a chameleon copy, one who notably lacks his accent. But anyway, Samantha is an interesting one-off character, and perhaps more interesting than most due to her original intention, because she was originally intended to be a new companion, but Pauline Collins declined the offer, and so she became a one-off. This gives her a more proactive nature than most one-off female characters, with her playing a big part throughout, getting into trouble as she tries to find out the truth, and is a big part in finding the chameleon originals. Although saying that, Jean is used pretty effectively as well, with her being far better used than most if not all previous one-off female companions, and so it feels more like the writers were just better at using them. Now we have Jamie, who is basically going solo for the first time, although he's somewhat sharing the spotlight with Samantha. One of the serial's goals was to really push the Doctor and Jamie's relationship and dynamic, with Jamie feeling like a fully formed character for the first time. This also steps up the comedy a lot, with a very notable instance when they're being asked for their passports. Despite this, I don't have much to say about Jamie still, because although he is more prominent, he hasn't hit his stride just yet, acting more as a part of a duo, although he does get a few interesting moments, notably when we have him stealing Samantha's ticket and taking her place in the plane. There is a bit of romance between the two of them, but without Samantha being a long-standing companion, it doesn't go anywhere. Although whether this stuff was added after they knew she was going to be a one-off is something I'd like to know, as it could have either been added because she was a one-off, or they might have been considering a romantic dynamic going forwards. Finally, the Doctor, who is of course very well utilised. First seeming to be a madman to the staff at the airport, but eventually showing he's a lot saner than he first appeared. This is of course the second Doctor's first serial set in contemporary Earth, and so is quite the departure from what has come before with him. Having him being faced with more relatable people both in terms of the airport staff and general people is fun. His humorous side is on full display, especially with the new dynamic with Jamie, which changes it from him just being silly to a fun double act. I haven't much to say about him beyond that, as the only notable thing to me is his treatment of Meadows after learning about him being a chameleon. But I do want to bring up the scene in which he survives nearly being frozen, and then went on the satellite and he sabotages the chameleon's machine. It's a strong outing for this incarnation, but not a favourite overall. I guess now it's time to discuss Ben and Polly's departure. So this serial takes place on the same day as the final part of the War Machines, and so Ben and Polly return at the end of episode 6. And realising the date, they decide to leave, making it appear as if they never left at all. Their final goodbye with the Doctor is quite touching, but given that they've been almost completely absent from this serial, really hinders the emotional impact. I don't know if this is better or worse than the Dodo situation, because she at least went out on a high and never returned, compared to these two just disappearing and then returning episodes later just to say goodbye, and basically reminding the viewer that they'd done nothing. With the quartet now a duo, the Doctor and Jamie go to the hangar the TARDIS was being stored in, only to find the TARDIS has gone. Behind the scenes there are two things to note about this serial. The first being the updated version of the Doctor Who theme, which is debuted in episode 2. Why episode 2 and not 1? Who knows? Probably the same reason it wasn't used for the Macra Terror. This new composer is of course iconic, probably more so than the original, and was used up until the end of the 17th season. The next thing is this was the final serial in which the BBC worked with Shawcraft models, after the problems with the macro prop being unusable. This strained relationship finally ended with the satellite and freezing pen props. The satellite faced continuous issues with the doors failing to open, the bulb exploding without a replacement, and there was no way to hang it. And when a way was found it fell to the ground and repair work was required. Then the freezing pen broke while on the final shooting day at Gatwick and required several days to repair. So with all of these problems, the production team broke away from Shawcraft, and the work was given to the BBC Visual Effects department from the next serial onwards. So The Faceless Ones is a long serial, and while it's full of ideas and plot, it's one of many that could have been far better if it was shorter. It does mark the first script to be written, or in this case co-written by Malcolm Hulke, who would go on to be a big player in the early 70s, but this isn't his strongest or weakest. It doesn't treat its companions too well, with two of them getting completely sidelined in their final story, but the other does really come into his own after multiple serials not knowing what to do with him. Although things have been shaken up for the next serial, as now the TARDIS team is much smaller, and the dynamic between them is far stronger and funnier than the last few, which means that things are looking up for the season finale, which leads perfectly into, with the TARDIS missing, it soon transpires that it has been stolen, with an old enemy of the Doctor behind it, who needs his assistance. Next time, the evil of the Daleks.